The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I've got some bad news for you. There is a substitute teacher. That is me. I am Professor Matt Sienkiewicz, often a guest on this show and some of Ben's other programs. I'll be filling in today, but I have good news. There is a substitute teacher, but the world's greatest hall monitor is also here. You like that metaphor, Max? He's nodding, but you got to talk.
Hey guys.
All right, so this is Max Inhofe. You may remember Max if you've been listening to Ben's show for a while. He was the producer on the show back when it was at the Boston studio. He was a guest host or a guest person on the bonus show back then.
Yeah.
And this is being recorded in Boston, actually, in the halls of Boston College, Max's alma mater and my place of work. Again, I'm Professor Matt Sienkiewicz, a professor of media studies and international studies here at Boston College. Got a lot of things lined up for the program today. I have a couple interviews, but before. So in my day job, Max, I try to avoid talking too much about stuff that kind of goes into my personal identity. I try to be scholarly, and I try to talk about things from an outside perspective. But Ben sometimes brings me on for that, to talk IR, to talk media theory, that sort of thing. And sometimes I'm just the Jewish correspondent.
Yeah, talk about Israel.
Yes, right. So talk about Jewish stuff. So I thought we'd do that for a little while here. Okay. Partially because I don't want to talk about the President of the United States. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I mean, he fired somebody like he always does, but we're gonna skip that for the day. And so I thought I would talk talk about one charge of anti-Semitism and then levy another.
All right,
and the levying's basically a joke. We're going to do that. We'll do that second. But before we get into that, first, give me a follow on Twitter. Follow me at Media Studied, so I know that you're listening. Max, what's your Twitter handle?
You don't have to follow me.
Follow Max. Find Max and do at him. Especially. Well, we'll see how he performs today, but you should rate him. Rate him on a star system of your own making. All right. So in terms of current event stuff off the top here, I want to talk a little bit about a place that I've been to and I've done a little bit of research on, but I'm not going to pretend to be a full-scale expert on by any stretch, and that is the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about Jeremy Corbin, about Labour, and about the accusations and sort of identifications of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, particularly some of the stuff going on with Corbyn. Have you heard about the protests that have been going on over the last few days over there?
Protests? No, tell me about it.
Very good, Max. I was very. I'm totally convinced that you know nothing. So there's been accusations surrounding Corbyn regarding anti-Semitism for a while now. Mm-hmm. A lot of these are not directly about him. They're about other Labour ministers. Ken Livingstone's probably the most noteworthy of this, a guy who said some let's just say questionable things about Hitler being a Zionist and things like that. That's not what Corbyn has been accused of, but there have been other things in the past. They mostly relate to sort of kind of complicated Middle East stuff, the way that Corbyn tends to talk about Hamas, tends to talk about Hezbollah. And generally when you look at these things, they could be read as sort of giving away his hand and in a way that is going to make parts of the Jewish community uncomfortable, but there's also elements of it that you're sort of policing language in a really specific way, and maybe he's trying to do something diplomatic. It's always like a little bit wishy-washy. Obviously people disagree with that, but I would put forth and say that when he talks about these things, he's often clumsy, but it's not clear what the clumsiness comes from. A new sort of controversy has erupted lately.
Yeah, why are people protesting?
Yeah, so this is more direct, right? So those sorts of things got into like op-ed columns, but there weren't people in the streets. Yeah. This situation, it's a little bit convoluted, but different from the others. So a while back, I think it was 2012, a while back, there was this mural somewhere in England, and I'm going to show you a picture of the mural, Max, while I describe it here. So Max is, so maybe Max is onto it. So this is a mural, and it's a picture of there's a number of men. There's 6 men. One is sort of bearded. A lot of them have these kind of mustaches. They tend to have, as the press has reported, sort of hooked noses.
Pretty bald.
And there's a lot of male pattern baldness. This is true. And they're playing a board game, looks like Monopoly, and there's all these sort of workers who are bent under the board game. Let me ask you, Max, what is your interpretation of this mural?
There's also kind of an Illuminati thing
There is.
going on in the
There is an
background.
Illuminati, yeah.
Floating eye pyramid.
Yes.
Like $1 bill thing.
That's right. So what is your interpretation looking at the image?
Yeah, it looks like a pretty blatantly anti-Semitic. Like they look like, I don't know, Jewish bankers controlling the world or something like that.
It's a present interpretation, we would say. That is in media theory, that is a reasonable decoding position.
Okay.
It's a fancy way of saying, yeah, I could see how you could get that. You look at it, it looks like something from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an old forgery. It's a play, but it portrayed Jews sitting around planning domination over the world. This looks like it could be something from the program, from something like that. And Corbyn, I believe it was on Facebook, posted after this was painted over, right? So somebody complained about it and said, this is anti-Semitic, and it was painted over. And on Facebook, Corbyn's response was why? Why they paint over this? And he sort of compared it to people painting over socialist murals. Diego Rivera was brought up in it, right? The idea that this was just sort of an attempt to keep down critique of the capitalist system. So that's how he saw it. A lot of people look at it and say, how could you possibly miss the anti-Semitism in this?
Yeah.
And so there are possibilities, right? I'll ask you your instinct. I mean, you know a bit about Jeremy Corbyn. You know the reasons why a lot of people are interested in him. Probably a lot of people who listen to this show. He plays a really useful function as being a non-neoliberal international political figure.
Yeah.
When it comes to global politics, and we could talk about this a little more. He offers alternative perspectives. He's very fiercely sort of anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and there's an absolute place for that. That said, I mean, what is your take when you look at this and you sort of see how Corbyn responded? Could you believe that he just saw this and did not see the anti-Semitic elements present?
It sounds like somebody described it to him, and that's why he got mad about it.
Yeah.
He didn't actually look at it. Somebody was like, oh, they painted over this mural that I really like for XYZ reasons. He's like, oh, I should Facebook post about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's plausible. And there is an artistic tradition of murals, which are sort of anti-capitalist, that are pro-socialist, that get painted over. I mean, you could do that. If you miss it, maybe you don't look at it closely. I think that's right, but he can't say, oh, I never saw it, or I didn't. He probably saw it, right? He can't say, I didn't really look at it. I just go around posting stuff for like no reason. And so we're in this position now where it gets swept into a whole other thing, right? If it was a thing on its own, it probably wouldn't be much of a thing. But what it does is it sort of retroactively reframes a lot of the other stuff that's been going on in his rhetoric. So previously, the things that he's gotten in trouble for largely are things like saying friendly stuff about Hezbollah and Hamas, countries, not countries, but political parties within political spaces that are militant and that are sworn to the destruction of Israel. You combine that with some of the other things, other people in the Labour Party there have said, it starts to look sort of questionable. And then we see this, and we see his inability to discern what seems like fairly apparent anti-Semitism. And to me, the upshot is not so much that he's an anti-Semite, because I'm somewhat prone to your reading that he just didn't think about it. Mm-hmm. That's not really an excuse.
No, especially not when you're a leader, I don't think. And
maybe this is before he was really a leader, and I mean, he was a political figure, but nobody had heard of him in 2012. To me, the real worry and loss here, I mean, some of it has to do with him not seeing it if he didn't, but there is a loss here. All right, the loss is that for all of the ways in which I don't agree with everything he says, his place as a political leader who can question hegemonic institutions is really important, and there's not a lot of that, especially in a country like the UK. Yeah. And so when you look at this and you see how he responded, and now can we moving forward sort of trust that his response and his ability? Let me put this a new way. Anti-Semitism and or criticism of Israel are not the same thing.
Right.
There are many important criticisms that must be levied at Israel, like every other country in the world. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you're levying a criticism at Israel is not a problem in and of itself. That said, there are anti-Semitic strands of critiques of Israel. Yeah. Right? Critiques that approach Israel in a way that that the same person would never approach another country, and with sort of the drippings of old anti-Semitic hatred in there. Mm-hmm. If you want to be a critic of Israel, it is crucial to be able to discern those, to sort those out, to be credible, to say, look, no, I'm treating this the way that I treat the rest of the world. I'm looking at ethical issues, international law. I apply it fairly. I know what anti-Semitism looks like, and this isn't that. This is fair criticism. Mm-hmm. And the question is, and I'll put this to you just as sort of an outside observer, does a scandal like this make you question his ability to do that?
I guess because it happened in 2012, it wouldn't really impact so much of my opinion on him these days. But I think if you can fit it into like a broader pattern where you can say like there's some consistency of like making fairly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel attacks, which I don't know that to be the case. But if it does fit into that kind of a pattern, then I would find it like then it would be a problem for me. And
the issue is that it's always blurry, or it's often blurry. I shouldn't say it's always blurry. It often is, so when he's talking about Hezbollah and Hamas, I mean, those are groups that say things that are anti-Israel and things that are anti-Semitic, and the different aspects are sort of really intertwined, and. Now, when he talks about them, he's often doing it and saying we need to negotiate for peace no matter who is involved. That's just how global politics work. So when he says it, you just don't know, right? Mm-hmm. You just don't know what he thinks about terrorism, for example. You don't know. Well, you should probably assume he's against it, but if you impute onto him based on this other motives, it gets messy. To me, though, I want to be clear. The loss is less that I'm convinced that he would be a bad person to sort these out. It's that the credibility is damaged in a significant way. Like I want somebody in leadership position who can point to things that Israel does that need to be critiqued, and be able to do so with sort of a clean slate of credibility and willingness. And we're missing the willingness. Most global leaders, if they're not from a country that is overtly hostile to Israel, will not criticize Israel very strongly. Mm-hmm. He could play this role. This makes it harder. I don't know. Do you buy that?
It seems to me that Britain doesn't have a lot of role in the peace process. I don't actually.
Well, nobody does.
Okay. So. Well, I mean, you'd think that the United States, Israel, Palestine are kind of like the main.
Well, in theory, well, although the U.S. has completely, we've done nothing over you could argue we've done nothing in a very long time, but we've been extra doing nothing ever since the current administration took over. Yeah. But Tony Blair, for example, who is sort of a sworn labor enemy of Corbyn, has devoted a lot of time to Israel-Palestine issues. I mean, could he play a crucial role? I don't know. I think it's harder now. Mm-hmm. That's basically where I stand. To be clear, I'm not super interested in indicting him, what's in his heart, right, or even what's in his mind. I do think having this vulnerability to say, look, you couldn't figure out the most obvious anti-Semitic image in the world was anti-Semitic. How are you supposed to sort out what Hezbollah is up to as it relates to Israel? I don't know. It makes some sense. Yeah, you could take it or leave it. Well, we're trying to be nuanced. We're doing our best with it. So I'm not so much accusing him of specific anti-Semitism so much as maybe missing the point. I do want to go on a much more trivial path for a minute and accuse a football coach of anti-Semitism.
Yes, please.
You want to hear a really pretentious circa 2018 statement?
Yes.
I don't watch football anymore.
Why don't you watch football anymore?
Because I love football, but I can't stomach the brain destruction that is part of it. Yeah. So I'm going to admit that when I do this, I'm going to call this a story. Should I call it a story?
Sure.
I think I'm stretching that word.
Do it all the time.
The story is about two quarterbacks. I'm going to do another photo image for you, which the audience can't see. Sure. And we'll just describe. So there's two quarterbacks who college quarterbacks or former college quarterbacks who might be drafted very high in the NFL draft.
Nice.
You know enough about football to
enough. Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that they pick the best college players to go to be pros.
Right.
It's not super complicated. So there's this guy Sam Darnold and this guy Josh Rosen. And they are, well, I'm going to show you pictures of them.
Are they both Jewish?
They are not both Jewish, and that's going to be relevant. You're giving away the ending. I'm going to show you pictures of Sam Darnold. I'm showing you him. He's the quarterback for USC. That is a college in Los Angeles.
Yep.
And, here's a picture of Josh Rosen. He's the quarterback for UCLA, also a college in Los Angeles. Do these seem like fundamentally different people to you?
No, they look the same.
They're the same. They're very similar. They were both quarterbacks in the same city, like the same conference. Everything is the same. All right, I want to read you a quote this is from Josh Rosen, and you've given it away. Josh Rosen is the Jewish one. All right, this is a quote from Josh Rosen's coach. Now, Josh Rosen's coach should want the best for Josh Rosen and be advocating for him, right? Yeah. So the other piece of information you need, and look, it shouldn't be too complicated, is Cleveland has the first pick, and they're going to pay more money than all the other teams.
Okay.
Right? And generally, if you're an athlete or any person looking for a job, you want the most money, right? That's like pretty standard. I'm probably building this down to the ground too much. All right, so this is the quote from Jim Mora Jr., Josh Rosen's coach. Because of fit, I would take Sam Darnold, who's the other guy's quarterback, if I were the Cleveland Browns, who are picking first. I think he has that blue-collar attitude, gritty attitude. I think his teammates will love him. I think the city will love him. He'll say the right things. He'll come in and represent well. I think he kind of represents what Cleveland is. And then if I was one of those New York teams, I'd take Josh like that. So I'm going to end it there in terms of the quote. So Sam, who's and another thing that probably needs to be clarified, there are not a lot of Jewish football players.
Yeah.
Right, so it's not like there's hundreds of them out there. It's very, very uncommon. A guy named Josh Rosen is a big football prospect. So again, his own coach, calls the other guy who went, and if you know some college culture, I'll ask you, USC or UCLA, which one is like the pretty boy, like
USC?
USC, absolutely. UCLA is the state school. So the Jewish guy went to the state school. The private school guy is Sam Darnold, but he is a blue collar, gritty guy who the city will love. And then my favorite part of this story is that he says, if I was one of the New York teams, I would take Josh.
Only the New York team.
Only the New York team. But to be clear, it's not. So there's two NFL teams in New York, the Jets and the Giants. He's not like, the Jets have a certain passing scheme that will really fit Josh Rosen's, and the Giants don't. So the Jets should. No, he's like, Josh Rosen is going to have some bagel needs. he is gonna, he's gonna be really off-putting if he's outside of, you know what I mean? So, like, just any of those New York, it's like Ted Cruz, any of those New York values teams should be taking Josh Rosen. And this is costing him, like, a lot of money. If he gets picked first, he gets, X, and he gets X minus Y if he gets picked anywhere else. There's not really much else. Who's a bigger anti-Semite, Jim Mora Jr. or Jeremy Corbyn?
I don't know. This coach looks pretty bad right now.
What is he doing? What is he doing? This is okay. So we're gonna leave it at that. That's our anti-Semitism update on the Benjamin Dixon Show. All right, we've got a lot of things lined up for today's show. A couple interviews. We'll start off with an interview with Huffington Post reporter Daniel Marans, and then we'll have another interview with Dr. Alfred Martin, media studies professor from the University of Colorado, Denver. Let's take a listen. And now I have the pleasure of welcoming to the show Daniel Marans. Dan is a reporter for the Huffington Post, and he's joining us live from New York City. How are you, Dan?
Good. I'm doing well. Great to be here, Matt.
Oh, thanks for making the time for us. You are, as I mentioned, a political reporter at HuffPost. You do both on-the-ground stuff, and you're the kind of person that I want to talk to about long-term analysis. So let's aim for both of those in this brief interview we have in front of us here. You were on the ground for Lamb-Saccone for the Pennsylvania special election. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And
So, long story short, at least on that special election, is Lamb pulls out an exceedingly close race, correct? I mean, even after all was tallied, this was rather tight, right?
Right. So a few days after, just about a week after this March 13th election, Rick Saccone finally conceded to Democrat Conor Lamb again. This is a landmark victory. This has been huge if you haven't been paying attention to it. But if the Virginia state-level election results weren't enough for you, because it's a Dem-leading state now, if the Alabama Senate upset, where Doug Jones won in lieu of Roy Moore, because Roy Moore largely, we think, because he had his history of child predatory behavior, you could write that off as an aberration. You could write off Virginia as a Democratic state. This was a district that Trump had won by nearly 20 points. Yes, it's a special election where turnout is lower, and so enthusiasm counts for more than even in a midterm, but this was a serious bellwether. And what you had in Conor Lamb was effectively a guy who was a dream candidate for the district. He was sort of a custom fit. He was the son of the district in Mount Lebanon, which is an affluent, increasingly Democratic suburb just south of Pittsburgh. His uncle is Michael Lamb, is the controller of the city of Pittsburgh, and his grandfather was the state Senate majority leader in Pennsylvania in the 70s. So we're talking about a guy that comes from kind of Irish Catholic Pittsburgh royalty. At age 33, Lamb resigned his post as assistant U.S. attorney to run, so he's a federal prosecutor. And before that, he had been a JAG in the Marines. And he's an open practicing Catholic. So a lot of the interesting thing about this neck of the country is that this is very typical Trump Democrat territory. You have Democrats who still enjoy a slight registration edge in the district, and that's something that Republicans were sort of playing up to toward the end, who might continue to vote Democrat in their county commission races or their school board races based on funding and sort of kitchen table economics issues. But, whether it's the issue of coal or abortion or guns, or frankly, a harder line views on immigration or just the rhetoric, we're gravitating toward Republicans in the past 2-3 decades, and certainly especially in the era of Trump. One thing that I focus very heavily on, Matt, and this was important to me because what was the role of organized labor and labor unions here. This was a district that is really one of the union strongholds in the entire country. Labor, at least according to their own estimates of active and retired members, has over 20% of the district belonging to unions. I mean, for perspective, nationally, the unionization rate is, just over 10%, and that's heavily concentrated in a handful of cities and states. due to the public sector workforce, right? But this is steel country, it's coal country, it's union building trades country, and of course it is also, public sector workers. So that there was a broad array of different unions here. And it included unions that stayed out of the 2016 election because of their rank-and-file members' distaste for Hillary Clinton. So, the United Mine Workers of America did not endorse in 2016 because they saw Obama's Clean Power Plan as a threat to their industry and their existence. And so they refused to endorse, and obviously a lot of their individual members ended up voting for Trump. But here they were all out for Lamb. I mean, they held rallies for him. They were canvassing for him. This was a moment of a lot of, the sort of proverbial or quintessential white working class Democrat types, the Reagan Democrats, the Trump Democrats, however you want to put it, coming back into the fold. And Conor Lamb ran on a platform of fighting the opiate epidemic as he had as a prosecutor, but also protecting Social Security and Medicare and standing up for the area's labor unions. And unlike Tim Murphy, the previous Republican incumbent, who, although he was uncontested, actually got the endorsement of the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO in 2016, Rick Saccone was a pro-right-to-work guy. He was endorsed by the Club for Growth. He had opposed a number of labor's priorities in the state house, including an unemployment insurance bill, a transportation infrastructure bill, all sorts of things that made this a much easier contrast for labor to make to its members. And I met a lot of union members who said, I got the call from the union, this guy's on our side, the other guy's not. In fact, I knocked doors with the steel workers, and I met a coal miner who said, Conor Lamb's promised to back our pension. They have a distressed pension fund that some members from coal areas members of Congress from coal areas are trying to plug, and Rick Saccone was sort of vague on it. And so the reason I bring this up, we already know that the hashtag resistance played a big role in this. The Allegheny County sort of suburban moderate women in particular, that's where Conor Lamb rang up his biggest margins. And that's where you saw some of these new post-2016 election individual groups really springing into action. But that's been the story of a lot of these elections. It was certainly the story of Virginia. This may be the first election where we saw organized labor flexing its muscles and showing that they could bring Trump voters back into the fold, not by adopting Trumpism, not even by playing the 1990s Democrat game of, sort of conservative lock them up crime policies or hardline immigration policies, or even racial dog whistling. I mean, Democrats used to do that stuff. Bill Clinton did it. Yeah. And the new playbook is, no, if you at least try to sell these people on their immediate economic concerns, and you're not totally unacceptable to them on cultural terms, you can pick enough of them off. And so I'm talking about things like a small mill town called Burgettstown in the west of Pittsburgh and west of the airport there, that went 56% for Trump and went 56% for Lamb. And there were a number of different towns like that. Houston, Pennsylvania, Waynesburg in coal country, in Greene County. So it was very interesting in that way. Yeah. And I just think, look, I'm very open about my progressive views. I think that anytime Third Way comes forward, or the Blue Dogs, or the New Democrats, and they say this guy won by being a complete centrist, or the Republicans for that matter, claiming that he basically was, just Republican light. That was their spin afterward.
Right.
Look, there's no question there was a perfect storm here, and Saccone ran a comically inept campaign. But this was a guy who, on economic issues, ran as a progressive.
Yeah. So you described this as a playbook, right? You said that the playbook, which was largely in the narrative you've got here, based around authentic economic interests of not the upper class, at the very least the middle class, and people with less money, focused on labor. Is this a scalable playbook? Is this a playbook that's going to work more broadly in 2018, or is it too tightly fitted to that one district to be sort of something to use as a template moving forward?
Well, look, there's no question that there are district-specific considerations here, right? This is a district that is, like I said, heavily unionized, culturally conservative, gun-loving, right? And so Conor Lamb sort of famously declined to back additional gun restrictions, including what some people interpreted it felt was a pretty tone-deaf comment after the Parkland shooting, saying, let's not get too emotional here. That's what he did. That was sort of part of his answer on that. But
what can we learn? Right?
It's a 93% white district too.
Right.
So you're not necessarily, immigration and racial justice just aren't even going to come up as much on the stump. But there are. Look, here's the thing. There seems to be three different schools of thought on how Democrats should be playing going ahead in the future. Yeah. One school of thought was the one that Hillary tried, which is the Panera Bread strategy. We're going to get the affluent suburbs, the country club Republicans that dislike Trump's overt racism and his undignified sort of disposition. And we'll do that by floating candidates that are basically socially liberal and fiscally conservative. There's a school of thought of, let's say, the Joe Bidens and the Tim Ryan from Ohio, and to some extent Crystal Ball, that's like the white working class, can be brought back into the fold. And then there's a school of thought that is championed largely on the left, and especially in kind of the racial justice community, that says the issue here was not turning out the Obama coalition, and that it's much easier to turn out Obama non-voters than it is to win back Obama Trump voters, and that's the solution. And personally, I don't see a zero-sum game here, though I'm perhaps most skeptical of the Hillary strategy, because I just don't really look forward to a governing coalition that's we already have party donors that have an adverse influence and an outsized influence on the party. Rich white people, I don't really.
Right, you're saying that even if that one wins,
coalition.
right, then it doesn't get you where you want to be. That makes sense. Now, one question that's sort of in the background of all of this is that overarching. Does there have to be more or less a choice made? Now, granted, there's nobody to make the choice. There's not a single institution that can say this is what the Democrats are going to do across the country in 2018 or 2020. But do you think that the existence of three distinct and not totally contradictory, but clearly distinct approaches to moving forward, is that an inherent weakness, or can that be turned into a strength for the Democrats? Is there a need to get on board more with one approach or another in a broader coalition?
No, okay. So I think let a thousand flowers bloom. That would be my take. Show what succeeds, and the best way for your strategy to become the hegemonic strategy is to win. Now that's been complicated by the fact that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the party body that helps elect Democrats to the House, is picking winners and losers in primaries, and heavily seems to be putting their eggs much more so in that first Hillary, Panera Bread, affluent Republican basket, to the point where you even have a Democratic candidate in Virginia Beach, in Virginia's 2nd district, congressional district, Lane Luria, who admitted to voting twice for the Republican incumbent that she's trying to unseat. I mean, that's literally what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But, so those battles need to be had, not just for the sake of winning, which might happen anyway, but for the sake of the kind of monumental policies that will be brought into office. Now, you do have to tailor your message and tailor your candidate to a district. I think that process can happen organically, and we'll see. But I think what we saw with Conor Lamb is that customizing it matters, and it does work. But from a national perspective, and here's where we can transition into a 2020 discussion, the candidate that I believe, and I don't know who that is yet, that we can discuss specifics, but the candidate that can unite those different factions, that that at least won't earn the permanent enmity of the moderate donor-based establishment, and will pick up some more of those Obama, Trump voters, those white working class voters, and will excite the young progressive voters, the people of color that are infrequent voters. I think that candidate is the most likely to sew up the nomination.
Well, it's a lot to order. You're not 35, right? I thought you were about to announce your candidacy there.
I'm 30.
Yeah, very good. So we'll wait on that. That's a great description. And if we could weird science a candidate, right? If we could go into the lab and come out with one, I think that's a great formula. But of course, we have to deal with what we've got. And I'm not going to ask you to put forth any money on your predictions. But do you see actual human being out there who can do some of that recombination? I mean, is there a person who we know of who at least has like the beginning stages of hitting the majority of those marks you just put out there?
I'm gonna punt on that. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. But what I can do is I can tell you, I can give sort of what I see as on the lay of the landscape right now. Mm-hmm. You obviously have on the left, you have Bernie, who has sought to strengthen his patronage system. He helped elect Chuy Garcia to Luis Gutierrez's seat in the sort of Latino district in Chicago. It has now an organization, Our Revolution, that's endorsed a lot of different candidates. Whether they're doing that with enough financial largesse and effectively and fast enough, I think is a serious open question. But you have the fact that he's been basically touring the country with his message and holding these, digital town halls and building up his Facebook presence. He has Bernie TV, where he basically, puts these videos out that get, over 1 million views just with him interviewing, let's say, Bill de Blasio, or doing some, not even him, but his staff putting together some quick explanation or like a viral way to understand the tax cut. You've got Elizabeth Warren, who's sort of in that same camp, but she's shown that I think that what distinguishes her is that she doesn't embrace the socialist moniker, and her whole point, in her focus on consumer regulation and on antitrust, is that she actually does kind of believe in markets in a way that Bernie doesn't, but just that they need to be properly regulated intensively, and she has enormous credibility to bear on that issue. She donated $250,000 to every single state Democratic Party in the country, in some total. So
yes.
Whatever that is broken down. And she also rolled out. She's on board with Bernie's single payer plan, but she's also rolled out a healthcare law that's kind of like an interim bridge proposal that would increase regulations of insurance companies. I wrote about that. I was the first to report that out. That would basically make the current Obamacare framework better for consumers by tightening up regulations on what insurers need to offer and providing more support in the form of subsidies to consumers. And so those are two different components there. That's really kind of the left, I would say, and there are a lot of other potential unknowns. Then you've got this kind of broad, young, left-leaning middle, you could argue, in the Senate, Kirsten Gillibrand in New York, Kamala Harris in California, Cory Booker in New Jersey, who all have varying degrees of kind of moderate voting and governing histories, but have sought to assiduously court the left in the past 2 years, sort of reading the tea leaves a little bit. All three of them were on Bernie's single payer bill. Again, that was a major attempt to signal on that issue. And obviously there's the person of color component with Harris and Booker specifically. And they also enjoy access to donor networks that are different in nature than Bernie's. And then, you kind of, maybe in sort of the rightward flank of all this, you've got governors. So There's, of course, Governor Cuomo, who had sitting on $30 million, but is now going to be embroiled in another contentious re-election bid. Doesn't have a terribly good media presence, has very much elicited the enmity of the left. He's viewed as a transactional politician. He's blamed for failing to bring into the fold a renegade Democratic faction in the New York State Senate that caucuses with the Republicans, and many people believe that he enjoys keeping it that way, if you will. So these are all different issues that really need unpacking. There's Steve Bullock, who's a governor of Montana, who cuts a more moderate profile. If I'm running out of folks who I can think of here, but
do we have to address the Joe Biden question?
Well, right. So I think that's a very good point. So Joe Biden has firmly staked his flag in the white working class camp, and though he represented Delaware, one of the bougier tax haven states, and his legislative record really reflects that, and I'll get to that in a second. His sort of heritage from Scranton, and really his bearing, above all, his aw shucks working folks kind of shtick, which he is good at, has burnished him in that lane, and he's sort of spoken about it in a way as attributing the 2016 loss to that factor, and obviously, the Rust Belt strongholds that Hillary lost did cost her the election. There's more than one way to skin a cat, of course, but Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were extremely tight margins, and were three states that Obama won twice. He's stumbled already out of the gate. I think that he's extremely old. He's got a ton of history. That can be said of Bernie as well. But Bernie has not been on the inside of sort of the uppermost political strata for as long.
Yeah, there's less ugly moments that easily come to mind when it comes to Bernie.
Well, right, and I think you look at Biden's. The real mark on Biden is that he always was known as the senator from MBNA, which is a credit card company, representing the financial industry companies that call Delaware home, and he whipped hard for a 2003 bankruptcy law that made it harder to discharge debts, including medical debts, which we know is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in this country. And I believe even student debt. That's going to come back to haunt him. The 1994 crime bill is going to come back to haunt him.
Yeah.
Anita Hill
is already.
And then you have the fact that he's already using in his stump speech, so I'm going to take that guy around back and punch him in the face. Well, sure, that sounds macho and it's a little bit on brand, but one of my colleagues in journalism, Dave Weigel from the Washington Post, pointed out, don't complain that reporters aren't going to pay attention to the other 39 minutes of your speech when you mention that.
Yeah.
And when one of your criticisms of Hillary Clinton is nobody knew what her economic message was, and you're going out there and making this all about some, cojones contest with Donald Trump, look, we've already seen how a personality contest plays out with this president. It's not enough to get the infrequent Democratic voters out off the bench. And it's certainly not enough to win over these, sort of culturally conservative white populist types who are attracted to Trump for all kinds of reasons, some of them savory, some of them not. And, so that would be my cautionary tale about him, and I think a lot more of that is going to come out as it progresses. If I were to look in hindsight, just no question that he would have beat Trump in 2016. But that's sort of the situation as I see it. Are there any other names that I haven't gotten to?
Well, I mean, there are the let's say unconventional names, which I'd prefer not to drag up. I mean, other than that, Chris Murphy is a guy who I find interesting.
Sure.
Maybe Sherrod Brown. But I mean, these are all sort of. I guess one of the things is like it's an if, but we're it's not that we're running out of time for that, but TikTok.
Sure.
But
Sherrod. He's got a tough re-election bit ahead of him. Yeah. We'll see what happens after that. But he certainly checks a lot of different boxes. He checks the progressive box. He checks the winning in the Rust Belt working class box, and that'll be even truer if he wins again in 2018 for his third term. Chris Murphy's definitely interesting on foreign policy, on guns. One thing that I should say, it hasn't been reported out yet or anything like that, but he is very much rumored in Washington to be somebody who sleeps around. A married man. So make of that what you will.
Yeah, I'll leave that alone. But there are certainly it's worth noting potential vulnerabilities. Although I won't speculate specifically. That's an interesting point to bring up from somebody who does reporting down in D.C. It sounds like you're generally somewhat hopeful about this crowd having it's one way to look at it is if you have a lot of options, you've got nobody. You seem to be at least somewhat optimistic that there's enough talent in there that what percolates out will be viable and potentially even exciting. Is that a fair assessment of your assessment?
I think that's about right. Look, I don't make this just about the candidates. I make it about the political fundamentals and the energy from the grassroots and how they channel it. And if I could end on one final comment on this, I think that the biggest danger in 2018 and again in 2020 is that some of these top-down, mega donor-driven establishment groups, whether it's the D-Trip itself or the DNC or Emily's List, quite frankly, or sort of a number of other groups that I don't have time to get into now, or individuals or folks on TV, the danger is that they screw it up. And they screw it up by thinking that, well, the Russians screwed up Hillary's playbook last time, we can basically do the same thing again. Or we can take the Democratic base for granted. Or we don't need to run on a strong economic message. Look, at the end of the day, it is not a knock on the need for dramatic action to address racial justice in this country and create immigration reform and win equality for women, etc., to say that working for a living, the bills people have to pay, is the number one thing that unites all working people across this country. And it's if you don't resonate on that, and people again have a limited appetite for the kind of news that they consume, and they're looking at politics mostly through a straw, through local network television or what they see on their Facebook feed. If you do not bring that forward, because the Democratic donors don't want that to be the message and don't want that to be the governing coalition, then we could be in real trouble in 2020. That's the biggest danger, more than any single one candidate, more than any single grassroots division or trend.
Dan, thanks so much for joining us today on the Benjamin Dixon Show. How can the listeners reach out to you?
Check me out on Twitter, Daniel Marans. By the way, it's emphasis on the first syllable.
I've never gotten
Daniel,
that right.
M-A-R. Yeah, we've known each other for years. It's okay.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their things. No worries. At Daniel Marans on Twitter, DANIEL. MARANS, and once you're there, you can see my email address. All
right, I want to thank Daniel Marans from the Huffington Post for joining us here on the Benjamin Dixon Show. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon. Next up, we've got another interview, this time with Dr. Alfred Martin. Al is a professor of communication at the University of Colorado, Denver. And now I am pleased to welcome onto the show Dr. Alfred Martin. Dr. Martin is a professor of communication at the University of Colorado, Denver, with a specialty in Black queer media representation, but also just a guy who knows a whole lot about television and beyond. So me being a media studies professional, a media studies professor myself, I wanted to make sure we had some time today to do some media studies talk. So Al, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I am, of course. This is the Benjamin Dixon Show. Just to make sure you know where you're talking. I'm sort of playing the Gary Shandling role, filling in for Ben tonight. So first I want to do a little current events when it comes to TV, and then I want to talk about your specialty, being okay. Black queer media. So Roseanne, the reboot of Roseanne, got huge numbers last night, 18 million viewers. This is, of course...
It did.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? To me, this is crazy. This is, of course, just season 10, but season 9 was, well, it was a long time ago, right? It was the 90s.
Right. Yeah.
So what's your just immediate take on the fact that, we don't have event TV very much anymore, and that's kind of pushing the event TV number, 18 million. What are your thoughts on the fact that it would be something like Roseanne and sort of a reboot or continuation that would get us that kind of number?
So I think on one hand, we can't sort of divorce the fact that these numbers are huge, and in many ways they dwarf what happened with Will and Grace with its reboot when it had roughly 10 million viewers. And certainly, when we look at the televisual landscape, those kinds of numbers are really outstripping some of these newer shows. So we can't sort of divorce the idea that what Roseanne did and what Will and Grace did is absolutely huge. What I also, though, the ways in which I want to temper it is that, those are premiere ratings, and a lot of us tend to tune into things for the sake of curiosity.
Yeah. And
we have our curiosity satiated, and then we may not tune in the following week. So I want to certainly acknowledge that what Roseanne did is fantastic for ABC and for the series, but I'm adopting a sort of, ask me again in 3 weeks once we see when folks sort of settle down and say, oh, this is what this thing is doing, the nostalgia's worn off, and do I really want to still stick with this?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I do think we have to contend, as people who are interested in television culture, contend with this move towards nostalgia. I mean, to me, it seems in some ways it's nostalgia for event television. It's not just nostalgia for Roseanne. It might also be nostalgia for shows that everybody watched, right? And there's something,
right.
Yeah.
Right, because I think what's really fascinating is that we're not necessarily going back to the 2000s or to shows at least that started in the 2000s and rebooting. We're actually going back to the sort of the last vestiges of the 3-network system era, and sort of the early sort of 4 and perhaps even 4 networks, 2 netlets era. And I think that's also really significant because we're going back to a particular time when NBC was, NBC Thursday nights in particular was must-see TV.
Right.
We are going back to a time when Roseanne, in some ways, although it was from the same production company, really represented the anti-Cosby. And I think that's very fascinating and important for this particular moment.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and I think that there's a natural transition from that into questions of representation, which are sort of the bread and butter of your research as a media studies professional. So we are looking back to the era of network dominance with all of this nostalgia. Of course, that was a time in which TV. I mean, you could still say that network TV today maybe isn't as diverse and inclusive as it might be, but it certainly was not achieving standards that people who cared about that were happy about in the 90s. That nostalgia has to include some. You have to be a little uncomfortable. At least I think I'm a little uncomfortable with that nostalgia for an era in which television was, very white and almost exclusively straight and so on. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I think in some ways we can tie this in a lot of ways to the 2016 election, which is that in some ways. Part of the impetus for at least a segment of the population was about this sort of, hey, we've done too much of this progressive stuff. And certainly, of course, it is a sentiment with which I do not agree, but that was certainly a kind of impetus. And so I think in some ways this nostalgia is in some weird way wrapped up in the nostalgia of a time gone by that we experienced with this past election, with at least certain segments of voters.
Yeah, and it's there's an attempt, clearly, if you actually watch the episode of Rosanne, to capitalize on some of those ideas, a little winkingly, a little ironically, but you have the playing out of that in the actual characters in the episode. Let's use that as a jumping off point to sort of more your specific area of research interest. You've got when is your book coming out? I don't want to get it wrong. Is it coming out this year or next year?
Yeah, so it'll be 2019. Okay. So it's still a bit of a ways off.
Oh, that's all right, but and maybe I'll have another chance and bring you on right when the book does come out. So the book, at least I'm reading off your CV, the title is The Queer Politics of Black Cast Sitcom, Black Gayness Inside the Generic Closet. Is that still what it's called? Mm-hmm. So
actually, I'm just using the first part of that right now, but we'll see once it gets through marketing.
Right. So the queer politics of black cast sitcom. You can set your alert for 2019 to see when that comes out. But what I wanted to ask you about is sort of to just give us a kind of overview idea, and I wanted to offer a framing, and feel free to push back on the framing. And that is that I think when it comes to queer representation on television, there's sort of a progress narrative that gets built in, right? There's none, and then there's some, and then there's Ellen or something like this, right? But smart people, particularly progressive smart people who are looking at nuances, know that any kind of clear progress novel, a narrative is going to have problems. So I was wondering if you could help frame that in general, and then particularly in the case of queer black representation.
Mm-hmm. So if I could sort of in some ways continue on our initial conversation about nostalgia and sort of going back in time, what I'm part of the interest in this topic is an industrial and a cultural question. And so what it is really about is that in 1996, I believe it was, Entertainment Weekly dubbed the 1990s the gay 90s.
Right.
And for those who were paying attention to the late 80s and the early 90s, we saw the emergence of the Fox network, and then we also saw Netflix, the WB and UPN in I believe it was 96. And so with those sort of new networks, so Fox and UPN and the WB, part of their strategy was to target black viewers, black/urban viewers, and create these black cast series. And so part of what I'm actually interested in is sort of the notion that those two things, so the gay 90s and what we might call the black 90s, never necessarily found a way to work together to make sort of blackness and gayness happen. So in the so-called gay 90s or in the so-called black 90s, what we had was these one-off characterizations of gay characters on series like Moesha, and even series like Will and Grace, wherein they had Taye Diggs on for a number of episodes. And part of what I'm interested in on one hand is this progress narrative and disrupting this progress narrative and sort of talking about the ways that we need specificity when we talk about what gayness is and what it is not. But at the same time, I'm also looking at sort of how do we sort of, if we can use this word, how can we fix what's happening? And so part of it, I think, is that we are actually getting a number of producers of color as well as LGBT producers of color. So people like Alina Waithe, people like Lee Daniels are in some ways eschewing this sort of one-offness of black gayness, and instead are in some ways making it an integral part of their series. So, for instance, there is a recurring and integral black gay character on Empire, and then of course when we sort of shift, what I actually think is really fascinating right now is that there are three, or I guess I would count two, black cast dramas, The Haves and the Have-Nots, and Empire. So The Haves and the Have-Nots is from Tyler Perry, Empire, of course, with Lee Daniels, that are actually trying to shade the ways that we see black gayness within television. And I actually think that's quite both interesting as well as exciting.
Yeah, no, Definitely, it makes a lot of sense to me, right? The idea that again, that moment of the '90s, right? We're celebrating diversity, we're celebrating the inclusion of queer characters, and then there's definitely a greater representation of African Americans. But you're making a really wonderful point that it's taking a long time for them to come together. What is the political, sort of the sociological, the outside of the media takeaway, the importance? I mean, can you make an argument for just let me know what your thoughts are. Why does this matter, right? What can we?
So I think in some ways it is about the industrial imagination of blackness. So if we go back to 2008 and we think about the passage of Proposition 8, despite the evidence to the contrary, the rhetoric that came out of that is that, essentially black folks went to the polls and voted for Obama, so black folks in California went to the polls and voted for Obama, but at the same time, they helped to defeat Proposition 8 in California.
Right.
And of course, when we actually parsed out the data, that was really not true, but that was the fail-safe because the industrial understanding, or the cultural understanding rather, of blackness is this sort of innate connection to our religiosity, which also has an innate connection to notions of homophobia. And so those kinds of notions then color the industrial discourse. And so then black viewers are understood as being always already anti-gay. And so in some ways, then the reason that this matters is that when we're talking about representation, we actually have to sort of back out and understand what the cultural understanding of audiences are. Because contrary to all of our popular belief, the networks are not spending a ton of money doing research on audiences. They are actually just going with what's in their gut.
Yeah, no, I think that's.
So what's in? Yes,
I was just going to say that's really. You continue. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say what's in their gut then colors what gets greenlit, what kinds of stories get told.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great connection to make, right? That this sort of lazy analysis regarding both candidates people are voting for, and then also simultaneous. So Prop 8 was against gay marriage, right? Banning it in California.
Correct.
Yeah. So right, I can. The point you're making is really it sticks, in that you could see that media could reaffirm a mistake. Right, you could look at this thing, you could misunderstand and think that the vote for the black candidate was paired with the vote against gay marriage, and then you'd have these media representations that sort of deny black queerness, and that might reinforce something that's out there. And so, do you think that the progress that we've seen subsequently has worked in effective ways to mitigate that sort of misunderstanding and erasure of black queerness?
I think not necessarily. I think the thing that has perhaps helped is the further segmentation of audiences, such that this idea now that we have, a show that can get renewed might only, and I put that in quotes, have 5 million viewers, whereas, in the golden age of television, you needed to have 33 1/3% of everybody who had their television on at a time, watching your thing. And so in some ways, the further bifurcation of audiences has really, I think in some ways given a lot of voice to some spaces or some stories that we might not have heard before. So, even things like Netflix, things like, AJ Christian's Open TV, all of these different kinds of platforms are, in a lot of ways, really helping to tell some untold stories. At the same time, the problem, I would say, is also that while these stories are being told in these niche spaces, the media remains niche.
Yeah.
So it doesn't become, in some ways, a part of what we might term a national conversation.
Right. So you can find these stories if you look for these stories, but if you don't want to be confronted with them, if you don't want to see these characters who have been written out of the larger media venues, you can avoid them pretty easily, even though they're out there.
Exactly. So so it is not as if we have the 1972 version, black queer version of All in the Family, where presumably, quote unquote, everybody is watching it. Right. Folks are watching it, but we don't necessarily have a national television vocabulary that we share.
I think that's very well said. Dr. Alfred Martin from the University of Colorado, Denver. Thanks very much for joining us on the Benjamin Dixon Show. How can we reach out to you? If somebody's online, wants to find you, what's the easiest way?
So probably the easiest way is via Twitter, and I am at Alfred L. Martin.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. I very much appreciate your insights, and maybe someday we'll get to circle back on these issues again.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
That was good.
Thanks, Max. That's very kind of you. So that's going to do it for today's show. Big thanks to Dan Marans, it's Marans. He corrected me. And so I stand corrected. I also stumbled over Al's name a little bit, even though it's Al Martin. That's the easiest possible name. Yeah. But big thanks to them for both catching us up on some current events and giving us insights into the future and the past. And a much bigger thanks to Max Inhofe. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
I said one person's name right.
Inhofe, but
no, I got. Oh, the H is like 3 for 3. I also say my own name wrong, but intentionally. Yeah. I'm Matt Sienkiewicz. Give me a follow on Twitter at Media Studied. Blame me, not Ben, for any complaints about the show. Take it back. Blame Max. How do we spell that?
I'm here for it.
That's right. How do we spell that Twitter handle again?
GTFO.
Wow. Okay. Do we talk about when Ben's back?
Monday.
Ben is back Monday. We did talk about that. Good.
Yeah.
And Rebecca is going to be on tomorrow. All right. Very nice. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. It was fun doing the show. Hopefully we haven't angered anybody too much that we can't come back.
Oh, and you can actually follow me on Twitter at Maximillionaire. I won't spell that for you. So
Maximillionaire. Ben will tweet it out, I'm sure. All right. With that, probably Ben will have me on as a guest at some point, depending on the reaction to this. And next time Ben needs a fill-in. Maybe Max will take over my job.
Maybe.
All right, maybe. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. We'll see you.
Bye.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.